Hey, everybody. I'm Tony Blank from Orbit Love, and I'm thrilled to introduce this next talk for you. Sorry, run just a couple minutes late, but before I bring Brian up, I want to just say sorry about that. Sorry about that. But so thrilled to have Brian now talk about DX tips from the UX world, and I will let you take it away.
Yeah, totally. So I have a really hilarious joke at the beginning of this presentation, and I'm just going to skip through it because we are now running a little bit behind. Hello, I'm Bryan Robinson. I've been doing some form of web design development for about 16 years, and about half that time I've been doing relatively UX or UX adjacent work. And for the past 5 years or so, I've been doing a lot of DevRel work, developer education, DX. And so with that kind of merged history, I've seen a lot of stuff. But the thing to remember is that UX has been around for a long time and has a lot of frameworks. And the X in both UX and DX stand for the same thing, right? It's all about the experience. And really, DX is a subset of user experience. The use case is just for developers. So while there are a lot of frameworks that are thinking about UX, I like to think that they're also at the same time thinking about DX. I'm going to talk about a specific framework today that's really served me well through the past about 10 years. It's the Nielsen-Norman 5 criteria of usability. It's a framework that I've been using for a long time to think about both my work in DX as well as my work in just web development. About a decade ago, Nielsen-Norman wrote a blog post called Usability 101. It described the 5 quality components of usability. And the great thing about all these quality components is that they all talk about interfaces. They're talking about design, right? We talk about interfaces and we think about APIs, I standing for interface, CLIs, the I stands for interface. So they really can be mixed and matched. And I think that we can get a lot of quality out of these frameworks. So today's agenda, we're going to dive into the usability criteria, all 5 of them. We're going to think about what that means in terms of DX. And then we're going to discuss a couple examples of each one. I don't think we're going to have time for a short Q&A, but you can hit me up on Twitter at BRob, B-R-O-B, and you can ask me any questions you've got. I'm perfectly happy to answer. So we're going to dive in and sprint through this with the amount of time that we've got. So usability criteria number 1, learnability. Now, Nielsen-Norman defines this as how easy is it for users to accomplish basic tasks the first time they encounter a design or an interface. Now, in the DX world, we might think about what is that basic task? Well, there's this phrase, time to first hello world. This is absolutely one of my favorite phrases I've picked up in the past couple of years. I learned it from Cassidy Williams when I had a chance to interview her for the Algolia Developer Experience podcast. But there have definitely been other folks that have talked about this as well. And what it means can vary depending on your API or app. In the end, though, it means how fast can you get somebody to the understanding required to do the smallest thing with your app. Could be a literal hello world, print hello world, or it could be like the first meaningful use of a very specific feature inside. So let's talk a little bit about how we get to a good time to first hello world. When I think about learnability, my brain automatically turns to documentation, but the whole scope of documentation is incredibly overwhelming to new users. There's deep dives, there's like specs, there's API reference. It can be a lot. If you want their time to first hello world to be as tight as possible, you need to think about quick start documentation. And here's an example I like of that. It's from Tailwind. Their overall docs are pretty strong, but I really like that first their landing page for their documentation goes directly into their quick start guides. But then since Tailwind can be used by so many different types of people and in so many different ways, they've actually broken up their quick start into these 4 kind of tab groups. First and foremost, they have their main way of using it, which is the Tailwind CLI, but that might be overwhelming for some people. They've got use post CSS, which is one specific way of using Tailwind, but then they also have framework guides. Each JavaScript framework that can utilize Tailwind, which let's be honest is N+1 because there's always a new JavaScript framework, has a guide represented in the framework guides, and they're very specific to how you set them up with a Next or a React or a Nuxt, that sort of thing. And then finally, they had this idea, the play CDN, which a lot of CSS frameworks have done over the years. Put this link in your HTML, and then you're off to the races with whatever classes you want to use. But the thing I like about what they've done is not only can you use all the classes within Tailwind, you can also do all the configuration that you might do in your build step right in the browser. And I think that's really powerful for learning about this long term. Not only can I start using the classes, but I can also dive in and start theming it. all from this browser code, all from this CDN. Things like Bootstrap and Foundation back in the day, you would literally have to export out a new file from their like UI WYSIWYG on their website. This is something that I think a lot of front-end frameworks, especially CSS frameworks, gloss over. So yeah, next up in terms of learnability, we want tight REPL cycles. We want the ability to read, evaluate, and print in that loop over and over again, and it needs to happen in very quick succession. Sorry, I'm reading something from tech in chat. Okay. So the REPL loop can take many forms. One thing to keep in mind is to make sure that your tool or your API is super performant, because nothing kills the learning momentum quite like having to wait 5 seconds for a load, 10 seconds for a rebuild, whatever it is. The other form to think about when it comes to tight REPL cycles is actually to control the experience entirely and include these things inside of interactive code editors in your docs and your learning material. One thing that I really enjoy is Lit's Playground. Now, Lit is a web component framework, and they do this really, really well. Not only do they provide a REPL experience, a full page app that works this way, but instead of just a big blank slate or a simple little hello world example that you then have to do everything else for, they actually bring all of their learning concepts into the playground itself. You click on any of those links in the left sidebar and you get a full-fledged example of everything that you might need to do. And then you get to immediately start tinkering and playing with the code. Now, the first two examples are actually flavors of Hello World. The first one is literally just printing Hello World, which isn't exactly compelling for a web component framework. The other one is actually the very first, what I would call interactive Hello World, the very first feature use of the Hello World in this. And it's a toggleable Hello World. I think you can say Hello World or Hello Mars, which is kind of nice. This gets something on the page super fast, in use, tweakable, interactive, and is my favorite part about the Lit experience. They really thought through how these tight REPL cycles could happen. So that's very quick on learnability. Next up, let's talk about efficiency, which is arguably one of the more important pieces of this. We want users to, after they have learned the design, quickly perform tasks. When I think about this in terms of DX, I think a lot about developer ergonomics and getting developers a greater understanding of the depths of your API. So to get them the understanding of the depths of the API, this is where those longer form documentation pages come in. Instead of the quick start, we want best practices and guides. These best practices, if you don't give them to your community is just going to do their best. And developers can make things work even with the worst code possible. So those best practices that your community is making up may not be best practices. So I think it's important to kind of control that experience. I really enjoy the beta docs from React, beta.reactjs.org. Speaking of making things work, I am a super mediocre developer in all point of fact. And I've been making React work for like a decade now. I wouldn't say I'm good at it. I wouldn't say that I've had a lot of understanding of what's going on in it, but I've made it work. So a lot of the underlying pieces never really clicked for me until I dove into them via the docs on this beta site, where they actually do a deep dive into each concept, and then they follow all those learnability tips that I mentioned in the beginning. They've got, quick REPL cycles, interactive examples. They even have a quick start section. This is all like super important to the long-lasting nature of how they've worked through this, but they've gone very deep and made me have an understanding that I can then use to grow and be a little quicker and more efficient with the product. And then next up, and I think this is super important in terms of efficiency, is tooling. Tooling is where we save devs the most time on many tasks. Any task that a dev needs to do more than a few times a project can be automated and kind of tooled out. And the most common use cases for tools are things like CLIs, SDKs, and some external tools as well. And I think in terms of external tooling, we can date a lot of these things back to the grand old days of web development, in which case we talk about Firebug. Firebug was one of the initial tools for doing front-end development properly and well and learnably, if that's a word. So Firebug really changed the way that front-end devs worked. Firebug was an extension that you could get for Firefox, and it really was the precursor for so many things inside of DevTools today, whether that is the browser DevTools built into Chrome or Firefox today, or things like the React Visual Inspector or the View Inspector that are extensions inside of the same browsers. So really, when you think about building tooling around your API or your app, don't just think about SDKs and CLIs. They're both super important. We'll talk about them, but also kind of think outside the box and how can you actually help somebody gain a greater understanding of your tool at the same time as becoming more efficient at debugging. So not every tool has the ability to be inspected like an inspector like this would give us. So next up, I want to talk about CLIs. And CLIs, are kind of ubiquitous in the dev world nowadays, especially more so than they were about a decade ago. But if people follow me on Twitter, they know that I'm kind of a Netlify stan. I can't help it. They really hit a sweet spot for the way they think that the web should be built and the way that I think about it. But one of the big things I've really fallen in love with within the past few years is their CLI. It handles everything that I would like copy and paste or have to go outside of my development environment to do, and puts it all in the CLI. It handles everything I can do in the UI. It provides boilerplate for things that I never remember, like serverless functions. It has a server built in. It lets me actually share that server with other people, kind of replacing ngrok for me. It mirrors the production environment, letting me debug that. It handles environment variables, both download and upload. It handles site creation. It handles site linking. It's like they found every efficiency that they could from within their app, and they shoved it into a CLI. And they've actually done a pretty good job of making it usable at the same time. So I really, really enjoy their CLI. Give it a look. It has all the features that you'd probably want out of a host CLI. Then we talk about SDKs. I'm not a huge user of SDKs overall, so I pulled the engineering team at Orbit to kind of talk through what their favorite SDKs were. And my favorite of the ones I looked at from their suggestions were the Prisma SDK. And what I like about the Prisma SDK is that it focuses on use cases. SDKs are probably unnecessary if you have a really, truly great API, but APIs aren't focused on use cases necessarily. They're focused on the server, or they're focused on HTTP verbs or something along those lines. What a good SDK can do is abstract out the way that the API works from the use cases that the developer is looking for. And with Prisma, we've got lots of ways to find objects, filter objects built directly into the SDK, which makes it much easier to use than just the API structure underneath it. We also have some features that can sometimes be kind of a burden on an API, things like batching and nesting. So this kind of front example lets us create a user and then nest 2 more data objects under it, or actually as many data objects as we want underneath it, to create all these at once in something that might have taken me 3 or 4 different calls to an API, or to understand a batch API, which isn't always easy. Now, I don't really have a lot of time, but I'm going to go ahead and throw this important discussion up that came up while we were talking about SDKs internally. It's very important to note that SDKs are probably by their very nature going to be less performant than using the API. I like to compare it to like an ORM for databases. An ORM is never the most efficient way to make a query to a database, but they almost always drastically speed up the development process, which I think is really important. Now, performance is a key factor in the end user experience. So sometimes SDKs and ORMs can be a detriment to your overall UX. But I think that a well-built SDK can keep a novice or a new dev from making performance mistakes within the API, things that the API doesn't care about because it's just an API, the SDK can care about built into the use cases. So when you're building the SDK, codify your use cases, codify your best practices, and always keep performance top of mind, because in the end, these APIs are going to, in fact, impact UX. All right. Let's keep this train moving. I'm kind of going at a sprint. I know that. We're going to talk about memorability, which is my favorite word from all of these. It's kind of fun to say. Memorability, defined by Nielsen Norman, is when users return to the design after a period of not using it, how easily can they reestablish proficiency? And in my mind, this really kind of equates to syntax and boilerplate. I have absolutely no memory when it comes to syntax. I'm always looking things up. So whatever we can do to make it so that maybe I don't even have to memorize things is going to be solid DX. And in my mind, this goes towards IDE extensions, VS Code extensions, stuff like that, right? So first and foremost, boilerplate is the enemy of memorization and efficiency. The more boilerplate code that has to be written, the less a dev can think about all the other things that they should memorize or all the other use cases that they want to get to. So let's get rid of the need to memorize some of the syntax by creating IDE extensions that do a lot of the work for us. A great example of this is from when I was a DevRel at Sanity.io. And because I'm terrible at syntax, I could never remember how to build out some of our schema. We had, lots of different fields. We had some very specific things we had to go through to do the boilerplate for even getting started. And we had a VS Code extension. And it made it so I didn't have to worry about it. I could start typing schema, and it would give me the Sanity schema, and it would give me the default, and it would give me some efficiencies around it too. It would read the name of the file and build that directly in to the variables on the page. But then I could also get every single field that the Sanity Studio provided. Images had kind of a wonky syntax, so I could just basically type Sanity image and get that field, and it would spit it out on the page. And then I could make the simple tweaks that I needed to. So there's a lot of things that kind of come into that, but building out reliable best practices in this way also works. I'm going to keep harping on best practices all day long. So speeding ahead, it's also important to talk about conventions. Not every piece of code is going to be able to be generated from a code gen. So for the things that have to be memorized, I want to talk about conventions and standards as much as possible. So I don't have really like a great visual example of this because like hopefully a lot of people are doing this. But when I talk about consistency and conventions, I mean both industry-wide as well as consistency within your own API. So industry-wide, I'm talking about things like, imagine if somebody built an API and made up their own HTTP verbs. I know that's like not a real thing really, but maybe it's out there. Or imagine maybe more realistically, they return slightly skewed response codes. Instead of sending us a 404 for a resource not found, they're going to send us a 500 as a server error. That's, I think, within the realm of possibility. Or they use post for everything, right? A change to a document, that's just a post, when really it should be a put. So we want to make sure that we think about how the industry is building these things as well, because that's going to make it so that a dev can pick things up from another place and use the same ideas on ours. Again, REST, things like that are really great for it. And then on top of that, we want to have internal consistency as well. It's really important as somebody moves around your entire API surface. An example of this would be, let's say you've got a blog, comment, and an author data model for a blog. They all have creation dates, but one has a date, a date object, one has a created at, one has a date time. These are all the same piece, but they were maybe coded by different developers on the API, and maybe it's a huge API surface. It makes it very difficult to bounce around that API and have a consistent experience. And that consistency is what's going to enable developers to memorize the way that the API works. Consistency, very, very important in memorability. And then this one is kind of the Debbie Downer of the criteria. It's errors. How many errors do users make? How severe are the errors? And how easily can they recover from the errors? The first two things, hopefully, we've taken care of with a lot of the other criteria. But that last one, I think, is really, really important. Errors in the DX world are, well, they're errors, right? You write code improperly, and either the console in the browser or in your IDE spits out big red text and lets you know what happened. But it's not always helpful, and it should be more helpful. So for me, I want to see a more human readable approach to errors, but also super descriptive and super meaningful as well. So Elm, like 7 years ago now, wrote a great blog post called, what's it called? Compiler Errors for Human. They went on a real readability tear in their language, and it does a lot of interesting things. First, it blocks things out by color coding and adding these lines and dashes up top, and that's going to make it. I mean, who amongst us hasn't seen an 85-line error and hasn't been sure where that one ends and the next one begins? Like, it's really hard to differentiate. Let's put some nice color coding and some long lines to kind of differentiate. But then when you get an error, sometimes it's just going to say, we found this error on line 15, column 24. What the heck does that mean? Right here, they actually bring that out and they underline it. They say, this string is the problem. This string is the unexpected value. And then here are some ideas on how to fix it. Here are some things that you need to know. Now, the only thing I think they could have done to improve this is to add a link to more information. And that's what my team back at Sanity, where I used to work, did a good job of. They made it somewhat human readable. This is an error from when you're handling images improperly in their block content JSON, which is a little bit of a complex issue. So hopefully these two things straighten you out. But if they don't, here's a piece of documentation written specifically for this use case. So when you can, link out to a more meaningful description of what's happening, or it's a learning opportunity built directly into the errors. So make them human readable, make them use case focused, and help solve the issue with as much text and visual flair as you can. And then the last one, and I'm hoping I can get this done in about 2 minutes, and we can have 5 minutes Q&A, or maybe you can just bid me farewell, is a positive note, satisfaction, which Nielsen Norman defines as how pleasant is it to use, which is a little bit of a wishy-washy subjective take. And in the design world, we sometimes refer to this as little moments of joy. And I think we can do that in the dev tooling world as well. One things that I really, really like is the Vue CLI. They went out of their way, and this was like a long time ago. This was super early in Vue's Vue's work, where they made their CLI as close to a UI as they could possibly have it. And I love that they went for it. And as you configure this, you're able to like use the arrows and select various pieces, or you can select their defaults, which they already have, which have the best practices codified in. So kind of along the way, they also make sure that you never forget what you've selected. So this last kind of image down at the bottom shows that I've gone through 4 different steps, and it shows my answer to each of them. So I never forget where I was. And this attention to detail makes for a very low stress onboarding experience. And low stress is exactly what I want for satisfaction. And then here's another example. Most devs use Git. I've learned to love Git, but I would never have described it as an enjoyable process, as a pleasant process. And GitHub being built on Git always inherited some of that same unpleasantness. But then they had the unfortunate nature of having to also deal with devs who wanted to be in their CLI, but then having to bounce them to a UI on the app, on the website. And so they created their own CLI, and they did a lot of things that I think are really, really good for like efficiency and all that. And I could have focused up there. They've got like dealing with issues, dealing with PRs, all that good stuff. But the thing that brings me total satisfaction in what they thought about for this CLI is that they let you assign aliases inside of the Git command. So I've got, my own aliases in my bash RC or my Zoosh config or what have you. But I never really thought about the fact that a CLI could have an alias baked directly into it. So in this one, they get you a list of bugs with just GH bugs instead of that really long flag happening there. So I think whoever thought of that was just thinking, oh, this would be like a nice to have, but it really brought me a moment of joy. And I think that that's an important thing when we talk about satisfaction. So I've breezed through this. So in quick summary, when we're talking about DX, we're actually talking about UX. When we're talking about UX, we're talking about 5 criteria for usability. Learnability, in our case, is going to be time to hello world. Efficiency, we're really talking about dev ergonomics, but not at the sacrifice of UX. Memorability, we really want to not make people memorize. We want to make people have the code at their fingertips. Code gen. Errors, good human readable errors that explain what happened and explain how to fix it. And then satisfaction, always go that extra mile when it comes to your DX. It is a user experience piece of your product. And that's it. And I'm kind of under time, I think. So we can take questions. Maybe, I don't know, they might boot me off. Or you can ask me at brob or brian@orbit.love.
Yeah, we're actually a little bit over time, so there's no great job fitting in the slides, dude. But yeah, we'll have to do questions on social and do that later on. So
Yep.
thank you so much for the talk, and thank you so much viewers for viewing, and enjoy the rest of the talks today. Enjoy the conference tomorrow, and I will see you all around in the chat. Don't forget to visit the Partner Village and talk to some of the sponsors over there. So enjoy the rest of the day and have a good one.